It was October 7th in 1913 that the moving assembly line debuts at Ford factory. For the first time, Henry Ford's entire Highland Park, Michigan automobile factory is run on a continuously moving assembly line when the chassis, the automobile's frame, is assembled using the revolutionary industrial technique. A motor and rope pulled the chassis past workers and parts on the factory floor, cutting man hours required to complete one Model T from 12 and a half hours to 6. Within a year, further assembly line improvements reduced the time required to 93 man-minutes. The staggering increase in productivity affected by Ford's use of the moving assembly line allowed him to drastically reduce the cost of the Model T, thereby accomplishing his dream of making the car affordable to ordinary consumers. In introducing the Model T in October of 1908, Henry Ford proclaimed, quote, "I will build a motor car for the great multitude," unquote. Before then, the decade-old automobile industry generally marketed its vehicles to only the richest Americans because of the high cost of producing the machines. Ford's Model T was the first automobile designed to serve the needs of the middle-class citizens. It was durable, economical, and easy to operate and maintain. Still, with a debut price of $850, the Model T was out of the reach of most Americans. The Ford Motor Company understood that to lower unit cost, it had to increase productivity. The method by which this was accomplished transformed the industry forever. Prototypes of the assembly line can be traced back to ancient times, but the immediate precursor of Ford's industrial technique was the 19th century meatpacking plants in Chicago and Cincinnati, where cows and hogs were slaughtered, dressed, and packed using overhead trolleys that took the meat from worker to worker. Inspired by the meat packers, the Ford Motor Company innovated new assembly line techniques and in early 1913 installed its first moving assembly line at Highland Park for the manufacture of flywheel magnetos. Instead of each worker assembling his own magneto, the assembly was divided into 29 operations performed by 29 men spaced along a moving belt. Average assembly time dropped from 20 minutes to 13 minutes and soon was down to 5 minutes. With the success of the magneto experiment, Ford engineers put the Model T motor and then the transmission on moving assembly lines. On October 7th in 1913, the chassis also went on the moving assembly line so that all the major components of the Model T were being assembled using this technique. Ford rapidly improved its assembly lines, and by 1916, the price of the Model T had fallen to $360. And sales were more than triple their 1912 level. Eventually, the price fell below $300. More than 15 million Model Ts were built before it was discontinued in 1927, accounting for nearly half of all automobiles sold in the world to that date. The affordable Model T changed the landscape of America, hastening the move from rural to city life. And the moving assembly line spurred a new industrial revolution in factories around the world. It was on October 7th in the year 1943 that Rear Admiral Shigematsu Sakebara, commander of the Japanese garrison on Wake Island, ordered the execution of 96 American POWs, claiming they were trying to make radio contact with U.S. forces. In late December 1941, the Japanese reinforced existing forces on Wake Island, part of a coral atoll west of Hawaii, in massive numbers after being unable to wrest the island from a small number of American troops earlier in the month. The Japanese strength was now overwhelming, and most of those Americans left alive after the battle were taken by the Japanese off the island to POW camps elsewhere. "96 remained behind to be used as forced labor. The Allied response was periodic bombing of the island, but no more land invasions, as part of a larger Allied strategy to leave certain Japanese-occupied islands in the South Pacific to basically starve in isolation. The execution and continuance of eternity of those remaining American POWs who were blindfolded and shot in cold blood remains one of the more brutal episodes of the war in the Pacific. It was October 7th in the year 1985 that Palestinian terrorists hijacked an Italian cruise ship. Four Palestinian terrorists boarded the Italian cruise ship Achille Lauro shortly after it left Alexandria, Egypt, in order to hijack the luxury liner. The well-armed men who belonged to the Popular Front for the Palestinian Liberation Front, PLF, the terrorist wing of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, led by Abu Abbas, easily took control of the vessel since there was no security force on board. Abbas has been responsible for attacks on Israel and its citizens in the early 1980s. On multiple occasions, he sent men on hang gliders and in hot air balloons on bombing missions to Israel, all of which turned out to be miserable failures. In an attempt to salvage his reputation, Abbas ordered the hijacking of the Achille Lauro. Yet there were no specific goals or demands set forth in the mission. At first, the terrorists demanded that Israel release imprisoned PLF members and sought entry to a Syrian port. But when Syria denied the request, the terrorists lost control of the situation. Gathering the American tourist on board, the terrorists randomly selected Leon Klinghoffer. The wheelchair-bound American was shot in the head and thrown overboard. He continued his eternity on this day. Klinghoffer's cold-blooded murder backfired on the terrorists. The world's outrage forced PLO chief Yasser Arafat to cut PLO ties with the terrorists and to demand that Abbas end the situation. On October 9th, Abbas contacted the terrorists, ordered them not to kill any more passengers, and arranged for the ship to land in Egypt. Meanwhile, the elite U.S. Navy SEALs were dispatched to raid the Achille Lauro. By the time the SEALs arrived, however, the terrorists had already gotten off the ship in Egypt and boarded a plane to Libya. Our response? We sent out 2 F-14 fighter jets, which intercepted the plane and forced it to land in Italy. A three-way standoff between the PFLP terrorists, the US of A, and the Italian army on the runway in Sicily ended with the Italians taking Abbas and the other terrorists into custody. Despite intense American pressure, the Italians allowed Abbas to leave the country and then prosecute the 4 who were on board. All were convicted, but only one received a sentence of 30 years. The others got off with lighter prison terms. Italy tried and convicted Abbas in absentia, but did not seek extradition until 2003. He was captured by U.S. Special Forces in Baghdad that year and continued his eternity in American custody in 2004.